Hi, I'm Steve Clemons, and I have a question. Can the U.S. and Russia end the Ukraine war without Europe, or even Ukraine? Let's get to the bottom line. Three years into the war between Ukraine and Russia, or 11 years depending on how you count, this war may actually be coming to an end, but not in a way that most folks expected. U.S. President Donald Trump is telling the Ukrainian side that they never should have even started this war. And his Secretary of Defense said that it's time to end the illusion that Ukraine would become a member of NATO or go back to its pre-war borders. At the Munich Security Conference, European nations were told that their involvement was not needed, and they are shell-shocked. Now the U.S. has started direct talks with Moscow, without Kyiv, to lay out a roadmap to end the fighting in Ukraine. So is the Trump administration rewriting the relationship between the United States and Europe? And is the old order just vanishing day by day? Today, we're talking with Melinda Haring, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. She's just returned from 10 days in Ukraine. And Anatol Lieven, director of the Eurasia Program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Thank you both for joining us today. Let me just start with the Munich Security Conference. I was there in the middle of it. I sort of felt and saw the dynamics of a Europe that said, wow, what just happened here? Of course, we had J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States. We had other major members, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, sending a signal that's very different than I've heard American leaders send. And many people, Melinda, thought that this was Neville Chamberlain all over again, where the Trump administration is essentially giving Ukraine, Europe, to Russia and Vladimir Putin on a golden platter. But there are a lot of other people who said maybe Donald Trump's a mad genius. Maybe there is something going on where he's shaking up the global system so that Europe is going to be stronger, more autonomous, and a better player. So I'm just interested in how you see this moment.
Steve, I think there's a plan there. I think J.D. Vance, our vice president, went into Munich with a plan to enrage the Europeans. He didn't talk a lot about foreign policy, and he accused the Europeans of hypocrisy. So Europe is very awake and very angry as a result of the speech he gave this last week.
Anatol, how do you see this moment? I mean, you've been, in a way, applauding Pete Hegseth, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, for coming out and publicly saying, hey, there's going to be no NATO role in this. We're not going to have U.S. troops deployed in Ukraine, sort of giving away the ending of the story before it's been negotiated. But you applauded that. But how do you see the Trump design right now? And do you worry that it may create green lights for further aggression by Russia?
I don't think that Russia has either the capacity or the intention to go further than Ukraine. Ukraine, you know, as people have been writing quite accurately in many ways, is a particular Russian obsession for a whole set of reasons, and a Putin-esque obsession, which certainly doesn't apply, you know, to the Baltic states or Poland. In terms of giving things up in advance, I'm not sure that's true because, you know, there are realities you have to recognize. And also, you know, one has to keep in mind that the Russians are winning, slowly and at very heavy cost, but they are winning. Time is on their side, so you needed something to unstick the whole process. But if I could just add on Vance and Europe, a point which I think has been partly missed is which Europe, and of course which America, because Vance was also reaching out to the right wing in Europe. And
to the very right wing.
Well, by now, I mean...
I might say this carefully, to the AfD in Germany,
right.
which
yes.
is the very, very right wing, which is, they call it, you know, Nazi proximate.
I think that's an exaggeration.
But nonetheless, it is the way many people, including Marie Le Pen, sees it in France. She won't deal... Marie Le Pen, which is very right in France, basically believe that AfD has gone over the line. So I just want to put this in our viewers' understanding that AfD has been considered and framed by many in the world as particularly repugnant of populist movements.
Well, yes, but then again, you know, if at some point down the line, which is looking, if you look at the whole pattern of what's been happening in Europe, highly probable, at some stage AfD forms part of the German government, as its analogues have elsewhere, you're going to have to talk to them. And of course, as for Le Pen, there is I would say the odds must be strongly on her or one of her representatives becoming president of France in 2027. And then, of course, you will have not America against Europe, well, not the Trump administration against Europe, you will actually have an ideological alignment between Paris...
Populists of the world unite.
Indeed. So Vance is, I think, also looking looking ahead here, but this is a symptom, not of the disappearance of the West, but of the disintegration of the West along ideological lines.
Well, Melinda, this is a really important, issue and statement because if Anatol is right, what does NATO mean anymore?
Steve, it means that Europe's on its own, and Europe is preparing for that reality. NATO is looking at adjusting its budgets, and we don't know right now. Macron called an emergency meeting in Paris, and he got the heads of state together, and they took a lot of selfies and they wrung their hands, but there's no actual output. And this is a problem. The Europeans are all over when it comes to Ukraine. So the Brits have said we would be willing to put boots on the ground if there's an American counterpart. The Americans are not in. The Poles don't want to go in. So Europe doesn't have they're not unanimous.
Anatol actually just wrote an article in Responsible Statecraft. I'm going to paraphrase it, but he basically said the Paris convening of world leaders was essentially a lot of sound and fury signifying nothing. I mean, I think I got that right from you. But Melinda, when you kind of get into it, the fact that Europe called this emergency meeting in response to what happened to the Trump administration's, play in the very, on the very front end of this, leaving Europe and Ukraine essentially out of the negotiations.
Right.
But how does that feel inside Europe at this moment?
I think tremendously stressful. Europe is freaking out, but all they're doing is talking. So Europe has to call a real meeting, and they need to decide, are we going to change our economies? Are we going to put production lines into place? And Steve, it's been 3 years. Your readers should have a look at the Quincy Institute. They keep a list of the difference between government commitments and then delivered military equipment to Ukraine. And there's quite a gap, particularly with France and Germany.
Anatol, you're an expert on global affairs and the history of relations with Russia, et cetera. Have you seen any negotiations like this where you've got essentially two warring parties, Ukraine and Russia, and the United States and Europe have both been involved in this, as have other nations, Iran, North Korea, et cetera. But it seems very interesting to me, whereas the United States is the primary supplier of funding and armaments to Ukraine, that Ukraine itself, which has become essentially a client of the United States, is not at the table in the Russian negotiations?
Well, I think it's a question of what's being discussed, because you have to remember, which people have too often forgotten, I think, that, for example, NATO membership is not a question for Ukraine. It's a question for the existing members of NATO. Each of one has a veto, of course, led by the United States. Similarly, I mean, US military supplies to Ukraine, exactly what the US will give in future and what it won't. Not a question for Ukraine, question for the US. Now, there are other issues in which Ukraine will have to be involved down the line, just as when it comes to the reconstruction of Ukraine and sanctions against Russia, the European Union will have to be involved. But I think there is a rational case for working some things out between America and Russia first, if only because the basic terms of the deal, I think, must be that America will accommodate Russia's wider security concerns to some extent.
You're so pleasant about it. It's sort of interesting in the pleasant way I'm hearing you, Anatol, talk about it. I'm almost seduced by it. But Donald Trump is blaming the conflict on Ukraine. Listen to what Donald Trump said.
I hear that, they're upset about not having a seat. Well, they've had a seat for 3 years and a long time before that. This could have been settled very easily. Just a half-baked negotiator could have settled this years ago. Without the loss of much land, very little land, without the loss of any lives, and without the loss of cities that are just laying on their side.
So Donald Trump, in a way, is saying, hey, this could have been done before. He blamed the invasion on the Ukrainians. It's a very different framing than saying, oh, we need to solve a few things with Russia first and then come back to Ukraine's equities in this mess. Donald Trump's blaming Ukraine for this conflict.
And everything he said is flat out wrong. Let's go through and parse the statement. Russia began the war, not Ukraine. He said that it would be easy. Any half-baked negotiator could fix this. Steve, that's absolutely false. This is one of the most complicated wars right now. 20% of Ukraine is occupied by Russia. And then you have the Crimea issue as well. You have 6 million Ukrainians living abroad. This is a very complicated problem. Russia has nuclear weapons. We could talk about proxies. I mean, this is a serious, serious problem. But I think what Anatol missed, though, with this format between Moscow and Washington is it's a massive change in U.S. foreign policy. So it has been the foreign policy of the United States for the last 30 years that there will be nothing, no discussion about Ukraine without Ukraine in the room, for obvious historical reasons. And they excluded Ukraine, and they treated it the aggressor state. Putin is a war criminal. He has kidnapped more than 20,000 Ukrainian children, and they're treating him like a normal head of state. And they're saying, oh, let's get back to business. Let's put ambassadors in each other's embassies, and let's pretend like none of this happened.
But that looks like where things are going. Anatol?
Look, Netanyahu is a war criminal, but I wouldn't demand justice against Netanyahu if this were to block a reasonable peace settlement between Israel and Palestine. You know, lives also matter.
Is Vladimir Putin willing to dance that dance with the United States and to give up his relationship with Xi Jinping, who said to him that the China-Russia relationship is a relationship without boundaries?
But of course it has boundaries. Russia is not going to fight for China. China is not going to fight for Russia. China is driving, I mean, this is, of course, one reason why the Russians want to restore relations with Europe. China is driving a very hard bargain with the Russians when it comes to Russian energy supplies, because they think at the moment they're in a they're in a buyer's market. So you're not going to get Russia to become an enemy of China, but I think that there are good grounds to hope that this relationship can be weakened.
Melinda, you were recently in Ukraine. I think you've just returned after 10 days there. What's the mood? Do they feel sold out? Do they think this is game over for them?
Steve, I was there before Munich and before President Trump's statements. So my observations are a few days old, but there's fierce determination. So I went out to Kharkiv Oblast. Kharkiv is the second largest city in Ukraine, and it's very close to the border. And I met with troops, I met with volunteers, and it's been 3 years. But people know that there's no alternative. And I asked a lot of people, why do you live so close to the Russian border? And they told me over and over again, this is how we show our defiance. We are Ukrainians, and we will stay here. So I saw a lot of determination. I also saw some things that were a reminder of what's at stake here, Steve. I went out to Izum. Izum in 2022 was the city outside of Kharkiv Oblast where over 440 bodies were found in mass graves by Russian soldiers. And that was a reminder of what Russia wants to do to Ukraine.
You saw Ursula von der Leyen laying down a historical marker at that moment that said how outrageous it would be to blame the victims in these conflicts. And you kind of hear Donald Trump blaming the victims in the Ukraine context. And I'm just interested, Anatol, if you see it differently, and to kind of unwind this knot of narratives. How do you do it in a way that both sides can live with each other after it's done?
Look, Steve, if we were to try to unwind, responsibility for the Ukraine war, while of course acknowledging that the chief responsibility is Putin's for invading, we'd be here all week. I mean, the origins of this are extremely complicated, and there is some fault on all sides, including America and the West. But I mean, von der Leyen's analogy is completely false. All the issues involved in Czechoslovakia and Hungary were quite different, except one thing was the same, which is that the West, led by the United States, although it had great sympathy for the Czechs and Hungarians, and had, of course, indeed encouraged the Hungarians in their revolution in '56, were not prepared to go to war with Moscow for their sake. We, the West, all these governments, the European governments, the Biden administration, have said over and over again, we will not fight to defend Ukraine. That, by the way, is what makes the idea of NATO membership so empty. It would dissolve Article 5 if you made a commitment to Ukraine that you have stated that you will not keep. So we have to keep that in mind. If we want to support a Ukrainian hope of complete victory, which has been over since the failure of their offensive in 2023, we'd have to go and fight for them ourselves, and we are not prepared to.
I should say that Secretary of State Marco Rubio nonetheless says that the goal of this is a sovereign and independent Ukraine. So for those people who are saying Ukraine is being sold out, he nonetheless is keeping on the table that vision. Now, I'm not certain how much influence or power over the negotiations Secretary of State Rubio has, but that framing is still part of the picture.
Yes, but look, I mean, nobody is talking, as far as I'm aware, in the Trump administration, of allowing the Russians to march into Kharkov, let alone Kiev, you know, to change the Ukrainian government, to take Ukraine into the Eurasian Union, or whatever. I mean, what we're talking about is, well, I think a bit like Finland, you know, after the...
Melinda?
No, but hang on. We're only talking about, at present, 20% of Ukraine, which would not be legally recognized as part of Russia, which would simply remain under Russia because the Ukrainians can't reconquer it. Now, the risk is the way things are going. I mean, this is another reason why I think that actually...
So the formula is autonomous regions?
No, there isn't. The formula is Cyprus. You leave this territory under Russia because you can't reconquer it, but you don't recognize it.
The international community doesn't recognize it.
No, China doesn't recognize it. India doesn't recognize it. But the point is, the reason why there is a case for speed is that if we leave this, given the way things are going on the battlefield, 6 months from now, it could be not 20% of Ukraine lost, it could be 25%. You know, there is a risk, serious Western military analysts have said this, that the Ukrainians could collapse completely. Now, at that point, you're looking at much, much greater Russian gains. But at present, you're not talking about that.
Right.
You're simply talking about the fact that the Ukrainians cannot regain militarily the land that they've lost so far.
Melinda?
It all depends, Steve. It depends on the kit and the troops that are given to Ukraine. So he's right that the Russians are winning, and they are slowly but surely inching further and further west. That's a true statement. Where I think we have an area of disagreement, real disagreement, is about elections. So what we saw in Riyadh was a formula, Steve. It's a ceasefire agreement with the 20% stop the fighting. The next element is elections, when to hold elections, and how do you do that in a legitimate way? And that's a huge problem because you have 6 million Ukrainians living abroad. Do you hold elections in this 20%, these 4 illegally occupied oblasts of Ukraine? What do you do with that territory? No single election expert that I can find says that it can be done legally. I interviewed the head of the Central Election Commission in Ukraine, and they laughed at me when I said, how do you organize something like this? And then the third element is a formal ceasefire. But Steve, the real elephant in the room and the issue we haven't talked about is not NATO, because it looks like it's not on the table. But what's the alternative security agreement? How do we ensure that the Russians will not come at Ukraine again? And we don't have a good answer to that question.
Anatol, you wrote a book many years ago. It was during the period we were invading Afghanistan and Iraq after 9/11. And it was called America, Right or Wrong, An Anatomy of American Nationalism. And there's a line in that book that I quote over, quoting you, and basically said America was king of the hill and was kicking down its own hill. How do you feel about this moment? Has America been king of the hill still over this period of time? And are we continuing to kick down the hill, or are we building a new hill?
I think you're building a new hill. I think part of the explanation of all this is that, Trump does have a sense now that this is a multipolar world, that other countries, are just much more powerful than they were 30 years ago, and that America must basically build its own hill, which it controls, completely, and strengthen that as much as possible in a very, it must be said, crude 19th century way, buying territory accompanied by threats, gobbling up mineral assets, insisting on your own Monroe Doctrine sphere of influence. But by the same token, perhaps, acknowledging that other great powers will do some of the same. The Russians use the phrase Monroe Doctrine so often you'd have thought they invented it.
Well, let me just ask you both finally, in this, I think when you're kind of looking at this broad question, Donald Trump's support is surging right now. Does that new nationalism of America, the new social contract, whatever it will be between America and the rest of the world, mean abandoning Europe?
No, it doesn't. So I just saw some new polling before I came in, and even among Republicans, there is still strong support for Ukraine. So I think it's incumbent on those who support Ukraine to make that message to MAGA Republicans. We try to talk about MAGA Republicans as one sort of soupy category, and it's not. There's a lot of different strains in it, and I think some of those strains can be convinced that U.S. national interests matter in Ukraine, U.S. national interests matter in Europe, and that we have to solve this, because if this war goes on for a long time, it's going to have implications for U.S. power abroad that we are not going to like. Steve, I'm going to play. I'm going to play the skunk at the garden party. I think there's a possibility that Donald Trump will get so annoyed at Vladimir Putin that he could go in the opposite direction. I mean, this is one of the nice things about Donald Trump is he's so unpredictable. Right now, he's headed in a direction where he's giving the bird to Europe, right? And it looks like it's as Anatol described. But I can see a world in which he
to our audience, just giving the bird means
the
flipping
middle finger.
off.
Sorry
the
about
middle
that.
Finger,
Sorry to speak it idiomatically. So I can see a world in which Donald Trump says, "I've had enough of you, you short little Russian stooge. You want to screw with me," and he can turn up the pressure on sanctions without issuing any more orders. He calls Treasury. It happens. He could force the confiscation of the $300 billion in Russian assets. He could really pressure the Russians if he wanted to. And I'm not a betting woman, but that is a play when I'm looking at the scenarios that could happen.
Well, Anatol.
Look, I don't disagree. I mean, we have to see what the Russians will demand in talks and what they're prepared to compromise on. If they stick by some of the things they've demanded, that Ukraine withdraw from more territory that it presently holds, that NATO withdraw all its forces from Eastern Europe, right, there will be no deal. And yes, I mean, Trump could lose his temper. So we have to see. I mean, obviously, other, Russian analysts have said no. If we can...
Is there a danger, just a final point?
Sorry, just one...
Is there a danger that this could be a Neville Chamberlain moment, that Putin reads the signals he gets from Trump as permission to go further in what he perceives to be his arena of influence, his sphere of influence?
Here, there was an interesting disconnect there, because you said, is America going to abandon Europe?
Right.
And Melinda, you replied, no, it's not going to abandon Ukraine. Now, these are two different things.
Right.
I actually said both, and I would put Ukraine in Europe, unlike you.
Well, no, but the thing is, if by Europe, as we've defined it in America, that means NATO, I don't think for a single second that America is going to abandon NATO within its existing borders, if only because NATO is airstrip 1. America needs the Ramstein Air Force Base and the Naples Naval Base, and they're not going to give that up. So America will continue to back NATO within its existing borders, but I think the further expansion of NATO, that's what's over, yes.
Well, great discussion. Melinda Haring at the Atlantic Council and Anatol Lieven at the Quincy Institute. Really appreciate your candor, and thank you both for being with us today.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
So what's the bottom line? What is really clear at this moment is that U.S. President Donald Trump is rewiring America's rules of engagement with the world. He's fundamentally altering alliances and changing the roster of who were friends and who were frenemies day by day. Now Trump is playing chess with other world leaders like Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, and he's using Ukraine as a pawn in this chess match. And he's happy to sacrifice that pawn for greater goals. Like what, you ask? Well, for one, if Trump tilts America's affections more positively toward Russia, then he might just be splitting Russia against China, just like Richard Nixon did decades ago. Back then, the nation that America hugged was China. Now it very well could be Russia. His critics will be saying he's giving a green light for Russian conquest, but no one knows what the real outcomes are going to be. That's why every world leader is on edge at this moment, and they're hedging their bets. And that's the bottom line.